Welcome to your deep dive. Today, we're diving head first, really, into a moment where, I guess you could say, political maneuvering and scientific disaster kind of collided, and that is the Chernobyl catastrophe.
Yeah.
And we're using HBO's The Lost Tapes documentary to really get under the skin of this event.
Yeah, it's a story that even decades later still has that power to, really shock. And not just because of the scale of the disaster itself, but the attempted cover-up that followed.
Right, exactly. And that's where we really, I think, need to start, with the context. It's 1986, Cold War is simmering, and the Soviet Union, well, they weren't exactly known for being open.
To put it mildly, you look back, remember the Kishtim disaster in 57?
Hmm.
A nuclear waste tank explodes in the Urals, and the Soviets, they kept it hush-hush for years. Yep. It was only when, foreign scientists detected a spike in radiation that, the truth began to trickle out. So this culture of secrecy, this controlling the narrative, it was ingrained, long before Chernobyl.
So this wasn't just an isolated incident. It was almost like a pattern of behavior.
Precisely. And Chernobyl, with all its complexities, it unfolded against that very backdrop. Now add to this, a leadership vacuum. Brezhnev had died just a few years prior, and the transition of power, well, it wasn't exactly smooth. There was a sense of, uncertainty, almost a paralysis within the Soviet system.
Okay, so you've got this culture of secrecy, you've got a leadership struggling to find its feet.
Yeah.
And then into this mix, you drop Chernobyl, a power plant that was supposed to be like the jewel in the Soviet crown, right?
More than that, it was a symbol of their ambition, their technological prowess. They wanted to prove to the world that the Soviet Union, they could build bigger, better, faster than anyone else.
And how did that ambition play into the disaster itself? I mean, what actually went wrong at Chernobyl?
Well, the reactor design itself, the RBMK-1000, it was known to have some inherent flaws.
Flaws. Give me an example. Like what?
For one, the reactor, it lacked what's called a containment structure,
Okay.
kind of a reinforced concrete shell that's standard in most nuclear plants.
Right.
It's designed to prevent radiation from escaping in case of an accident.
So a pretty critical safety feature that Chernobyl didn't have.
Right. And then there's the issue of what's called the positive void coefficient.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Let's unpack that a little bit. In layman's terms, what does that mean?
Essentially, it means that under certain conditions, the reactor, instead of, cooling down when things got too hot, it would actually increase its power output,
Oh, wow.
like throwing gasoline on a fire.
And that's obviously the opposite of what you want in a nuclear reactor.
Precisely. But these flaws, you see, they were known, at least among some engineers. There were warnings, concerns raised. But remember that whole culture of secrecy that we talked about?
Right.
Those warnings, they were often ignored, dismissed.
Because admitting a flaw meant admitting weakness.
Exactly. And the Soviet Union of that era, admitting weakness, especially on a project as prestigious as Chernobyl, well, it was unthinkable.
So they pushed ahead, flaws and all. What a setup for disaster.
And push ahead they did, right to the early hours of April 26, 1986. They were running a safety test on Reactor 4. A test, ironically, designed to see how the reactor would cool down in case of a power failure.
Oh, the irony. You couldn't script this, could you? A safety test that ends up triggering a catastrophe.
Life, as they say, is often stranger than fiction. During the test, a combination of human error and those inherent design flaws we talked about, they created a perfect storm.
So walk me through it. What happened in those critical moments?
Essentially, a power surge. It hit the reactor. And remember those control rods we talked about? Designed to slow down the reaction.
Yeah, like brakes on a runaway train.
Exactly. But due to a design flaw, those rods, when they were finally inserted, they actually accelerated the nuclear reaction, causing a massive power surge. And that's when Reactor 4 went supercritical.
Supercritical, meaning?
Meaning an uncontrolled runaway nuclear reaction.
Yeah.
And that's what led to the explosions.
This is where I have to ask, the HBO documentary, The Lost Tapes, it draws on firsthand accounts, right? What do those accounts tell us about, those initial moments after the explosion?
What's striking is the initial confusion, the disbelief. Many of the plant workers, they couldn't comprehend what had just happened. They clung to this belief that a Soviet reactor couldn't possibly explode.
Because that was the narrative. That was the narrative that had been drilled into them.
Right. And that delayed their response, their understanding of the gravity of the situation.
And what about the people in Pripyat, the nearby town? Did they have any idea? Did they know what had hit them?
Not at first. You see, the explosion happened around 1:23 in the morning, and life in Pripyat, it just carried on. People went to work, children went to school, all while being exposed to this invisible, deadly threat.
It's unimaginable. The documentary, does it offer any specific stories, any glimpses into that surreal disconnect between what people were being told and what was actually happening?
There's a particularly haunting interview with a woman named Ludmila Ignatenko. Her husband Vasily, he was a firefighter. He rushed to the plant immediately after the explosion. She talks about how he went to work that day, a seemingly ordinary day, and then he just never came home.
Oh my God! And her story, was that typical?
Tragically, yes. Many of the first responders, the firefighters, the plant workers, they were exposed to lethal doses of radiation. They went in not knowing the full extent of the danger. Many without proper protective gear.
And all the while, the government, they were still trying to control the narrative to downplay the severity of what had happened.
Absolutely. It took hours, even days, for the Soviet authorities to begin evacuating Pripyat. And even then, they told residents it was temporary, just for a few days. Pack light. People left their homes, their lives, thinking they'd be back soon.
And of course, they never returned. Pripyat frozen in time, a stark reminder of the human cost of this disaster.
And it wasn't just Pripyat. The radioactive cloud, it didn't respect borders. It spread across parts of Europe, contaminating crops, raising fears of this silent, invisible killer.
So this wasn't just a Soviet problem anymore. This was a global crisis, a global crisis, really, born from a system that seemed, I don't know, almost engineered to create it. This culture of secrecy, this suppression of information. Did the Soviet Union, did they ever acknowledge their failings? Like, did they ever take responsibility for what happened at Chernobyl?
There were attempts, but they were often overshadowed by this instinct to deflect blame, to protect the image of Soviet science and technology. A handful of plant operators, they were put on trial, made scapegoats for a disaster that went far beyond individual error.
So the little guy takes the fall while the system that enabled the disaster that remained largely untouched.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's a pattern, that we see repeated throughout history. But what's interesting, and this is where the lost tapes provide some really powerful insights, is that even within that Soviet system, even with the risks, voices of dissent, they did emerge.
Voices that were willing to speak truth to power. Who were they?
Scientists, engineers, even some within the government itself, who, once the full extent of the disaster became clear, they couldn't stay silent. They knew that a reckoning was needed, that lessons had to be learned, and not just for the Soviet Union, but for the world.
And did anyone listen?
It's a mixed bag. On the one hand, the Chernobyl disaster, it did force the Soviet Union and indeed the world to confront the very real dangers of nuclear power in a way they never had before. Safety regulations, they were tightened. International collaborations on nuclear safety, those were strengthened.
So some positive changes did emerge from this tragedy.
They did. But the legacy of Chernobyl, it's complex. The Soviet Union, as we know, it dissolved just a few years after the disaster. And while Chernobyl wasn't the sole cause, it certainly exposed the cracks in the system, the vulnerabilities of a government that prioritized ideology over transparency and accountability.
And that's a lesson that resonates, I think, even today, right? Because it's not just about nuclear power, is it? It's about the dangers of ignoring expert warnings, of prioritizing, short-term political gain over long-term safety and well-being.
Exactly. Chernobyl, it reminds us that whether it's a nuclear reactor, a global pandemic, or a climate crisis, the stakes are just too high to silence dissenting voices, to bury our heads in the sand.
It's a sobering thought, but an important one. So as we move forward, knowing what we know now, what's the takeaway? What can we learn from this radioactive blast from the past?
Chernobyl teaches us that transparency, accountability, a willingness to learn from our mistakes, those aren't just abstract ideals. They're essential for our survival. It reminds us to question, to challenge, to hold those in power accountable. Because the next Chernobyl, the next disaster, it might look different, but the root causes, the disregard for safety, the suppression of truth, they'll likely be the same.
A call to action for all of us. We can't afford to be bystanders in our own future.
Well, this has been a chilling, but I think eye-opening deep dive. Thank you for guiding us through this difficult but essential history.
It's been my pleasure. And remember, the story of Chernobyl, it didn't end in 1986. It's a story that continues to unfold, and it's a story that we all have a stake in.
And to our listeners, we hope this deep dive has given you something to think about, perhaps even something to act on, because the lessons of Chernobyl, they're not confined to to history books. They're as relevant today as they were all those years ago. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.